Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session. On the behalf of the American Petroleum Professionals of Iranian Heritage, APPIH, it's our great honor to officially start a series of webinars in the oil and gas related topics. Before introducing today's speaker, we have a short announcement. We will try to have every Wednesday a webinar. Next week on April 22nd, we will have a presentation by Dr. Amir Mahmoud Khani from the Locust Bioenergy Solutions Company. And on April 29th, we will have a presentation by Professor Reza Barati from the University of Kansas. During this presentation, if you have a question, you can write it down in the chat box. And if you want to ask your question personally, you can raise your hand. And after presentation, Mr. Karimi will answer to your question. Let's introduce today's speaker. It's my honor to introduce Mr. Moji Karimi. Mr. Karimi has a background in petroleum engineering with a broad experience from the deep water drilling methods to several new biologically inspired technologies with application in the energy. He's co-founder and CEO of Cemvita company, where they try to convert CO2 to value-added product with the biological methods. I would like to thank Mr. Karimi for accepting our invitation and transferring mic to him for starting his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Hamid. And thanks again for APPIH for inviting me to speak today and serve as the first speaker for this webinar series. I know this is APPIH, and with the Iranian committee, probably everyone thinking that we would start like after 10 or 15 minutes, but let's start actually on time. And as they will catch up, you know, there will be more time for discussion. And of course, please enter any questions you may have in the chat box to address at the end. This presentation that I'm about to show you guys was something that I prepared for Sarah Week 2020, which unfortunately was canceled. However, there's a bit of limitation for time. And here, because we have more time, I wanted to add a bit more context and would love to hear your feedback at the end as well. The future of oil is carbon negative, and this is enabled by carbon capture, utilization, and storage, or what we call CCUS. Some of these concepts may be new to some of you, so I'll make sure to add more context as we go through the presentation. One thing that we forget is that we think of oil not as a natural product, but as something that we have to drill for, to get out, and then use for different purposes. However, oil by itself is actually a product of nature. It's a natural resource that is being developed throughout millions of years. So let's think about where does the industry stand today, and how is our ecosystem set up for exploration of oil and gas. If we go all the way back to, first principle point of view of oil and gas, it all started when we had microorganisms like microalgae, zooplanktons, sequestered as CO2, a lot of times just directly from the air. And throughout, geological time, they were buried under layers and layers of rock, and with application of pressure and temperature, where the organic matter was deconstructed and formed into kerogen and eventually into crude oil. This process so far is all natural, like humans had nothing to do with this process. It happened way before we even got here. But here's where we come in as humans. We start drilling wells to get the crude oil out. That's the whole drilling industry. Also, from subsurface to surface, the product really doesn't change. Then we start building pipelines to transport the oil to refineries, and that's the whole midstream industry. And again, here, the product really doesn't change much, with just some degree of separation to make it easier for transportation. And then eventually we built refineries to apply chemical catalytic processes to change the crude oil into different type of molecules that we need, or to use it as a feedstock for power plants to create electricity. So when I look at this process, it has two parts to it. One that is human-made, one that is natural. But the overall process is actually very inefficient. We spend a lot of energy to go from the molecules in the subsurface to surface, and then to get to the molecules that we want. We've made a lot of progress in the last 100 years in the second part of the process. We have better drilling bits. We could drill horizontal wells. We have better pipelines. We have all kind of advancements in refineries. But hardly anything has changed with regards to the first part of the process, which was a natural process. So it's no surprise, that doesn't change, because how could we change anything about that? That's nature, and it takes, several millions of years for it to happen. I'm here to say some of that is actually about to change. We now have the tools to control some of the processes that happen in the first stage. And all of that is enabled by synthetic biology. For those who may not be familiar with synthetic biology, it's a field of science that allows us to engineer microorganisms to produce the specific molecules that we're interested in. The best example of that would be, GMOs in the agriculture industry. And synthetic biology in 2020 is now starting to disrupt a lot of industries. It started with kind of the low-hanging fruit industries, where pharmaceutics, from when we used to get the insulin from the pancreas of pigs, to now that we realize the gene that is making that molecule, and then we could make it in the lab. And then it is moved on to nutrients, ingredients. This is why you get a Impossible Burger at Burger King that is made synthetically. It's not meat. Also cosmetics, fragrance, and even cannabis industry is being disrupted by synthetic biology. So as an example, to make this a bit more tangible, in nature, you have systems that could take in sunlight, carbon dioxide, and water, and build complex structures that produce other molecules, including molecules that produce aroma, produce beautiful colors, and could also store energy. So how does this happen? And as humans, what do we know about this, and to what degree can we control this process, for a different future on Earth? So the question is, what if we could learn from nature and apply the principles of synthetic biology to shape a different future for the energy industry? What would that look like? If we were to do that, we could start actually with CO2 the same way that it happened in a natural process. And in this case, already we have emitted a lot of CO2. So there is really no lack of CO2 as feedstock through power plants, refineries, or directly from the air. And then we could apply the platform from synthetic biology to convert that CO2 into different molecules that we need. A few things that's important about this process is that, like anything in nature, these processes happen under ambient pressure and temperature. So you're not going to have to use a lot of energy that is common in chemical conversions. And also, because you're using CO2 as a feedstock, the end products are actually going to be carbon neutral or carbon negative. If we could simplify the way that we make the molecules with this method, we'll be eliminating a lot of the steps that I showed earlier in the way that the oil and gas industry is set up right now. And I think this is the type of thinking that we need to go all the way back to first principles and to see if our goal is to provide energy and produce these molecules that we need for our everyday life. how can we produce that? And then question every aspect of the status quo and rebuild the whole ecosystem. Now, I want to provide another example to make this even more tangible. Let's say that we want to produce ethylene from CO2. I'm sure you know ethylene is one of the most critical intermediates next to ammonia and is the feedstock for many chemical reactions that lead to plastics and polymers. So in this case, we'll look into nature and see, is there an example where ethylene is produced? And turns out that bananas in the ripening process produce ethylene. Because it's 2020, we know the genome of banana and we know the exact line of DNA code or gene that is responsible for making the ethylene forming enzyme. We could take that and insert it or integrate it into a host microorganism that could use CO2 as a feedstock. And now you have a super microbe that could take in CO2 and produce ethylene. And then once you do that, you could scale up the process from test tube all the way to a plant that looks like a refinery. So a few things happens when we develop pathways like this. On one hand, again, these processes happen under ambient pressure and temperature. So you take the common like thermal cracking out of the equation, and therefore you're going to save a lot of energy and therefore cost as well associated with that. And because we're using CO2 as a feedstock, you don't have to use the feedstocks that we use today for commercial production of ethylene, which could be ethane or naphtha, or if it's made from ethanol. We'll replace that with CO2. A lot of times CO2 could be procured at a lower cost or even for free. So that brings the cost of ethylene production down. And since we use CO2 in the process, this ethylene is going to be carbon neutral or carbon negative. Therefore, the plastics and polymers that you make from this is also going to be carbon neutral or carbon negative. So this is what the future looks like for manufacturing, is actually going to be biomanufacturing. And it's going to also enable a different type of industry for both oil and gas upstream and downstream. So you may ask, why do we need to do any of this? Is this just some kind of science experiment, or what's really the urgency for us to have to think outside the box and come up with these new methods? Really, the problem is the level of CO2 in the atmosphere and the pressure that it has imposed on heavy industries like oil and gas and mining. And one thing that we know, because of the analysis that has been done by IPCC, based on the Paris Accord, is that reducing emissions by itself is not enough to cap the temperature increase in the post-industrial level to 1.5 degrees or to 2 degrees. We also need to actively take more CO2 out of the cycle. So that's what is referred to as carbon negative technology. And the companies that are really not focusing on that, and they keep having a high carbon footprint, eventually within the next decade or two, I believe, are going to become irrelevant. And they will become irrelevant not because they're not profitable, but because they would get cut out of the investment pool that is based on ESG criteria, environmental, social, and governance. So these are activist investors who manage billions and trillions of dollars of investments based on the sustainability metric of those companies. And they're going to cut out heavy industries like oil and gas out of the equation, the same thing that happened with tobacco before. So these companies need to really reinvent themselves. And part of that is to apply the type of technology that I was talking about previously with synthetic biology. So if you think about CO2, I think it's a good question to ask, is it going to be a threat? And that's really the part that everyone has talked about and is very obvious. But could CO2 be an opportunity here? And You know, if so, how are we going to leverage that? I think CO2 could actually be an opportunity if we could learn how to use it as a feedstock. Now, to put that in context, let's look at the source of carbon throughout history and what humans have used. In the 19th century, we started with coal, and then we moved to oil in the 20th century. And that led to, you know, the situation we're in now with the emissions and, you know, the climate change that is becoming more of an issue. So I believe in this 21st century, CO2 is going to become more and more of a commodity that is needed to be used as a feedstock. And the question is, who is going to build that industry? Who's going to build the CO2 industry? Is it going to be a whole new industry created out of, let's say, current chemical industry or environmental? And if that happens, then what happens to the current oil and gas industry? Or is it going to be the oil and gas industry reinventing themselves at the cost of cannibalizing themselves to take the lead on building the CO2 industry? So this is a classic innovator's dilemma for those of you who have read the book that is happening right now in real time. This is the same dilemma that happened between Uber and taxi companies, between Netflix and companies who are renting out movies, and it's now happening in the oil and gas industry. So I believe that this is going to be an industry, either by oil and gas or new industry, regardless, and it's going to have different elements to it. So what we call CCUS, carbon capture, utilization, and storage. On the capture part, the idea is to capture CO2 either directly from the air or from the flue gas of power plants, refineries. The CO2 utilization is to then use that CO2 and convert it into other molecules that are more useful to us. And then eventually CO2 storage is just to sequester or store the CO2 in different forms so that it's out of the cycle. If you notice here, I gave a thumbs down to CO2 storage because it really doesn't have a business model. And even right now, it's just, you know, upon government funding, like tax credits would be, you know, to incentivize the companies to do so because they're not making money doing that. But once CO2 becomes more of a commodity, there's going to be more demand for CO2 for utilization. And therefore the CO2 storage is, I believe, is going to become, you know, irrelevant in the years to come. Now, I wanted to focus on two specific areas that we're very excited about with regards to CCUS, the way it is now and the way it will be in the future, to add more context. The first one is currently CO2 capture and utilization are viewed as separate processes. On one hand, we spend energy to capture the CO2, either directly from the air, like you see on the left side, or from the, you know, flue gas of power plants, refineries. And then we hand that over to the next group for utilization. So we spend energy twice. However, I think in the future, we're going to start integrating these processes to where we capture the CO2 and at the same time, we convert the molecule into other molecules that we're interested in. And when we do that, that is going to bring the cost down for both CO2 capture and utilization and lead to new business models for both of them. The second area is and I think this is the one that is a bit more maybe close to petroleum engineers, is that currently there is a lot of legacy in the oil and gas industry for CO2 sequestration and EOR. Probably there's got to be, I don't know, probably 10,000 SP papers on the topic. However, some of the newer principles for conversion of CO2 to other molecules on surface is really new, both to the oil and gas industry and in general. And these two principles are not really connected. So these people are not the same group of people that are collaborating. And that's an opportunity in the future to start closing the loop on this carbon cycle and start using CO2 that's captured, perhaps for the EOR process as well, and a few other innovative processes that we're working on. The only company that is a bit ahead of the game in this area is Oxy, and through Oxy Low Carbon Ventures, investing in use of direct air capture for CO2 EOR or other methods to utilize CO2 in the subsurface. So for us at the Cemvita factory, we're very excited about both of these opportunity areas and have active R&D projects to participate. So now I wanted to just add a bit more context for, when I see a presentation like the one I just went over, I always ask, okay, well then what are you doing about it? So here I wanted to share with you what we're working on at Cemvita factory. And really the idea is to provide more context and some tangible examples for how this could work out. And hopefully it would inspire, some of you to think about ideas in this area, either within your current companies or starting new companies. And I'll be also happy to help in any way that I can. So with Cemvita factory, it started with a simple idea, and that was to convert the CO2 that astronauts breathe out and use that as feedstock for conversion into glucose, which is basically the same as the photosynthesis process. And now about 2 years later, we're building that system, and it will be on the International Space Station next year. But while we're doing that, we realized really the bigger picture is to be able to use the CO2 and go to other molecules other than glucose, such as critical intermediate chemicals. And that led to our mission, which is creating economical carbon negative solutions for a sustainable future. The idea to see CO2 not as a liability, but as a resource, and use it as a feedstock to produce carbon negative products. So we put together this team of multidisciplinary scientists and engineers that come from oil and gas and energy background, and also from biotechnology and synthetic biology. And with our company based in Houston, guided by a world-class advisory board, we went to work. The team members that you see here, they come from, partly in a medical center, working on synthetic biology, tissue engineering, substrate programming, which are very transferable disciplines to synthetic biology. And on the energy side, they're a mix of both upstream and downstream. And that's because this carbon capture, utilization, and storage is a very multidisciplinary area of research and application. So the platform that we've built operates based on synthetic biology, which is genetic engineering of microorganisms, microbes, and that could use CO2 as a feedstock to then build carbon negative intermediate chemicals. And then once we get to that, then that could be used to produce a variety of different type of products that we use in our daily life, polymers, plastics, and fuels. One thing that I will mention here is you may have noticed there is now a bigger trend for consumers wanting more sustainable products with lower carbon footprint. That trend is now happening one step higher in the supply chain. So if you're producing, let's say, a lot of acetic acid, now those companies are also being asked about the carbon footprint of their products and how it was made. So that is really the opportunity for companies like us to go to them and provide that solution, a nature-inspired way to produce the same molecule that they could market better and possibly also charge a premium compared to their competitors. So how does this work? We have about 30 molecules that we have identified that we could make from CO2. We did that by looking into nature, such as the example I showed with banana, but also with many other examples for the 30 molecules. And we go to companies with high carbon footprint and we ask them, is there a molecule that you're producing today that we could make from CO2 and you'll be interested to sponsor? And once they say yes, then we go through our workflow to develop the pathway, build it first in the lab scale, and then scale it up, to 100 liter, 1,000 liter, and beyond. And again, just to, I've mentioned this a few times, really the benefit is that these reactions happen under ambient pressure and temperature. And also, just like in our body, these microorganisms or enzymes, or what we could call like a biocatalysts, they have a very high selectivity. So they will produce only the molecule that you're interested in, and they're not going to have a bunch of co-products and byproducts, which then you would have to spend more energy in the downstream part to separate and purify. So we have this library of microorganisms that we use for this purpose. These are, think of them as a small advanced refineries, basically, that we engineer exactly what we want them to use and what we want them to produce. They all have different capabilities. Some use light as a source of energy. Some use electricity as a source of energy. Some could survive in really harsh environments, or what we call extremophiles. And then depending on what application, we pick and choose what consortium of microorganisms we want to use. So we're commercializing this synthetic biology platform across 3 different verticals. The first one, which is the same industry you guys are in, is in the oil and gas and energy industry for conversion of CO2 to chemicals. But we have 2 other applications. One is in the mining industry for carbon negative bioremediation, which I'll talk about briefly in a minute. And also, as I mentioned, in the space industry for use of CO2 as a feedstock for building a regenerative life support system. I'll talk a bit more about this one too. So I have a very quick case studies about each of these 3 verticals to add a bit more context. In the energy industry, we're using CO2 as a feedstock to produce bioethylene, the same molecule that I talked about with the banana example. And what I wanted to share here about the case study is when we do the techno-economic assessment at a scale, we could actually utilize 1.5 megatons of CO2 per year to produce 1 billion pounds of bioethylene, or 500 kilotons of bioethylene per year. And more importantly, we could do that at a cost savings of 30% compared to what they're doing today. And that's really what gets this company excited about pursuing this pathway. And on top of that, the bonus is that this bioethylene is carbon negative. So they could market it differently, charge a premium to the companies that they sell this into. And this company also, they make their own polymer using this bioethylene, which is also going to be carbon negative. The other one for the mining industry, and this could be a new application, maybe the first time some of you are hearing about this, but in copper mining, once they're done with the mining and they leave behind a pond of contaminated water, which could have a pH of 2, a very acidic pond. And what I'm talking about is like 1 to 5 billion gallon of like pH 2 water. And sometimes this is next to a town, and it's a huge liability for these mining companies. And what they do now is really they just go dump line in the mine in trying to neutralize the acidity throughout time. And a lot of times they have timelines of like 50 to 100 years for remediation of these locations. What we have done, we have deployed our extremophile microorganisms that could survive in pH of 2, and they could take in CO2 and produce alkaline bicarbonates, which then throughout time would neutralize the acidity in the pond. And when we do the techno-economic assessment, we could actually treat 1 billion gallons of pH 2 water within the course of a year and a half to 2 years. And with that, a pond like what you look at in the left side, we could treat within the course of 5 years compared to like 50 years that they had planned. So this is an application in the mining industry that could also utilize 10 tons per day of CO2 in this case. And then finally, for the space one, and I'll talk about this just a little bit more because it's fun. You know, astronauts that are on the International Space Station, they breathe out 1 kilograms of CO2 per day. And if you do the back of a napkin numbers, if you have like 4 astronauts and they're on their way to Mars, which is going to take 6 to 8 months, and they're just breathing out CO2, that's a lot of CO2. And currently they capture that and they vent it out into space because they don't want it to get the air toxic. However, what we're proposing here is to use that as a feedstock and convert it into glucose, which then they could either eat directly as a food source. Each gram has 4 calories, or glucose by itself could be a feedstock for other biomanufacturing processes to make more complex nutrients like amino acids, fatty acids, vitamins, even proteins. So on the International Space Station, currently they have this system that is not active called the Cemvita system, which uses the hydrogen that is produced from the oxygen generator system that is on the International Space Station. Because the way they make oxygen on the International Space Station is by taking water into space, and then through electrolysis, they would, you know, break it down to hydrogen and oxygen. They used to vent out the hydrogen just again out into the space, but with the Cemvita system, they use that along with the CO2 to produce methane and water. And then they use the water, the methane, again, they vent out. Some of you, if you come from chemical engineering, you are more familiar with the Cemvita reaction. But when we looked at that, overall, it's a very inefficient process. So what we're proposing is to use the CO2 differently for life support supplies, because that's more of a key problem. And it's very expensive to take everything that you need to space. It's about $50,000 per pound of anything to take into space. So it's not about the cost of the thing, it's about just like the cost of getting it there. And then a bit more down the road for Mars, turns out that 96% of the air is CO2. And already both NASA and SpaceX have a lot of plans for how to use that CO2 as feedstock to build everything that they need for survival on Mars. And this is also part of the reason there's not a lot of momentum about building a colony on Moon, because there's no carbon there, no CO2 to use as a feedstock. But once you have CO2, you know, then you could start building the building blocks of life and, you know, make it more complex throughout time. So that's the space application, you know, that we're working on with the space agency in Dubai. So like anything else in biology, really the main challenge is always the scale up. You could do anything in the lab, but to take it into commercial phase is really the main challenge. And that's something we're very aware of. And for all the projects that we do from the beginning, we have rigorous stage gate planning to de-risk the technology and go through the different TRL levels. And we do a lot of techno-economic assessment and life cycle assessment at each stage to be able to commercialize this from test tube all the way to a full commercial plant. And one thing I wanted to add is, you know, we get this question all the time, which is, what is really the impact? Like, if you guys do everything that you were saying, what is the impact that your, you know, these pathways could have on putting a dent into climate change? And we've done some back of a napkin numbers for the 30 molecules that we're commercializing, coupled with 2 R&D projects that we have. If we do this across the next 30 years, by 2050, actually we could utilize almost 1 gigatons of CO2. And that's a really sizable number, but you know, it's also good news because we're just one small company, and there's many others, big and small companies, that are working in the same area and capturing, utilizing CO2 in different ways. So I'm really hopeful that we're going to live in a different world, you know, within the next 20 to 30 years with respect to climate change. And finally, I want to leave you with this thought, and that's basically, you know, especially for us in the oil and gas industry, we're kind of in a bubble, right? Like we think about our own industry more than trying to learn about solar, wind, and other areas sometimes. And the common story that we hear over and over is that, you know, eventually we're going to have solar and wind take over, and oil and gas industry would just kind of, you know, phase out. You know, the same thing that happened with, say, coal industry, you know. But really, when you think about it, really the only issue with the oil and gas industry is the emissions. You know, other than that, oil and gas are efficient ways of storing energy. We already have the infrastructure for transportation. We know how to both convert it into other sources of energy like electricity, or more importantly, use it as a feedstock to build all kind of petrochemicals and, you know, molecules that we use to make materials. This CO2 utilization area gives us a chance or a pathway, if you will, to solve that emission problem. So in the future, we could be living in a world where the oil and gas industry is thriving. However, through heavy investments in CCUS, we figured out ways to produce you know, fossil fuels and chemicals that are carbon neutral or carbon negative. And that's really what I'm hoping for. And, you know, for our company, that's what we're focused on. So with that, I think that was my last slide. And I think this would be a good time. Maybe I'll open up the chat box and see if there are any questions that I could address here. So I see a question here for what is the yield of the process for converting CO2 to value-added products? So this speaks to the techno-economic assessment that we do. And we consider a lot of things in that assessment. This is not just about, you know, just the yield of the conversion itself. It's also about how the process could scale, what is being used as a feedstock, how much are we paying for that, and then overall, does the process make sense economically or not? What I mean by that is that we could be in situations where the yield of the conversion itself is not very attractive. However, because we're eliminating the cost of the feedstock and because we're producing more targeted molecules with more simplified post-processing at a scale, the process could still be economical. So one thing that we do is for us as a company, we really stay focused on the synthetic biology part. And then we partner with our customers to help us with the process engineering and a scale up. So one example is what we're doing with Oxy and with OxyChem, and they have assigned their chief process engineer to us, and we're working together in developing processes to scale. So the next question is, what is the advantage of biochemical process over current chemical process? I think I've touched on this a few times. Really, the main thing is that it could be a lot more targeted in terms of not having unwanted co-products. Also, it happens under ambient pressure and temperature. So both it saves a lot of energy, which has two benefits. One is the cost. Also, you know, the emissions are avoided. Because a lot of times, as you guys know, to heat up a process, you're going to have to use electricity, which could be secured from, say, a power plant that is powered by fossil fuels. And for each for each kilowatt of electricity that is produced, you'll be emitting 0.6 kilograms of CO2. So we have to put that into consideration, or have access to different sources of electricity like solar and wind. The other question is, so it's jumping because I'm getting new questions. What kind of chemical conversion are you able to do with your biochemical process? So, we don't try to build like one-to-one comparables to like chemical conversions. Really what we focus on is like, what are the molecules that we want to make that the customers are interested in? And is there a pathway in nature where we could do that? Sometimes it is, and sometimes it's not. Excuse me. Some of these chemicals could be toxic to biology, so there's not a really good pathway to do that. But we really focus on the ones that there is a good pathway that is a bit more studied, and it could be scaled, and we focus on those. You change the gene of the bacteria to get CO2 as a feedstock. You may mention it, but I didn't get that part. If yes, what is the regulation of changing the genes? So that's a really good question. You could do two things. One is you could use the type of bacteria that is already using CO2 as a feedstock, such as cyanobacteria. And a lot of these are also photosynthetic, meaning they could use light as a source of energy. And then you would just integrate the gene to, instead of making, say, sucrose, to make ethylene. The gene comes from, say, banana to change the pathway for the end product. But there are also ways to work on making a microbe that is not using CO2 as a feedstock to use CO2. You may have seen there was one recent study where they have re-engineered basically E. coli, which is a very common bacteria, to be able to use CO2 as a feedstock. So people are working on both fronts. But for us, we mostly focus on using the microorganisms that are already using CO2, and we just add additional genes for production of targeted molecules. Oh, and then you had the question about the regulation. I'm guessing this speaks to kind of like the, who's regulating this, and kind of compared to like, GMO issues and all that. And basically, if you do this in a closed system, it's much easier to manage. It's all regulated by the EPA. And it's the same way as if you produce a new chemical that could be toxic. You have to file certain forms to let the EPA know about basically what is the gene that you're modifying. There's probably about half dozen scary movies that start this way with someone engineering a new species. Certainly you can just release them into the nature. The one place that we have more of issues with this is the mining application with the open ponds. And because of that, we don't release the microorganisms into the pond. We create feedback loops to manage it in our bioreactors. But it's a growing area, and a lot of it is like public perception. It's kind of like the GMO issue, with that is now almost like a non-issue in agriculture. And people realizing that, this is how we're feeding the world, is because we have done these to be able to have all the fruits in all the seasons. And now some of those techniques are coming to biomanufacturing. So let me go to the next question. Oil and gas companies have extensive experience in CO2 EOR and thereby storage. What do you think about GCS and opportunities? I'm not sure. Maybe they could type in what specifically they mean by GCS. Yeah, if you don't mind typing that, then I'll get back to this. I don't know if it's a top of the principle or the name of the company or something. In oil and gas, we have too many of these acronyms. Have you made any final product from CO2 conversion? Yes, we do have a few products that we have already made. One is the bioethylene, one is the glucose, one is the alkaline bicarbonates. We're also working on a few others out of the 30 molecules that we have identified. But one thing I would say is when we started this company, I looked into the business model of companies that came before us. And one thing I realized was a lot of companies that pick a product, they fail. And the reason they fail is because when you pick a product to produce, you have to go build the A to Z of the supply chain to produce that product. And it's not really trivial at all to try to learn to scale up these processes, like become your own EPC and build the expertise around those, especially for a startup. And by the way, if you do it all and get to the product, now you're now competing with Dow, DuPont, Chevron, and Shell, and that's also going to be hard. And if you're unlucky and the product that you pick is also a fuel, you're also your destiny is dependent upon oil price. And that's how a lot of the algae biofuel companies died in the early 2000s, and even big companies like if you remember when BP was Beyond Petroleum in the early 2000s, and none of that worked out. So yeah, I'm not sure if you talked about CO2 capture. I was wondering what's your take on CO2 capture as well as transportation issues. In particular, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on the economic pathway for capture technologies. So that's a great question, and we touched on this a little bit with capture. The one issue with capture is that you need to be where the utilization is to happen. If there is too much of a distance, typically to build a pipeline for CO2 for each mile, it would take $1 million. And that's what kills a lot of the projects if the capture and utilization are not at the same place. And not everyone is as lucky as Oxy to be sitting on top of the Permian Basin in the right geology for sequestration. One thing I would say, you have things like power plants or refineries that are fixed at a location, and they have to build kind of like what Oxy doing with like super highways to get all the CO2 and transport it into the Permian Basin. But one area that is enabled by direct air capture, and really one benefit, for example, the work that Carbon Engineering is doing, is that you could put those units anywhere that you want, and it's not limited. So I'm hoping that would open up new opportunities. For the, kind of relating it to the question that, that they asked before about CO2 EOR in the oil and gas industry. One area that I mentioned with Oxy Low Carbon Ventures, they're building a carbon capture facility that would capture 1 million tons of CO2 per year. And that's to be used in the EOR process in the Permian Basin. Oxy pumps about 20 million tons of CO2 per year in the Permian Basin for EOR. So that's a small portion of it, but it could be a growing portion. And that's what really one of the opportunity areas that I was talking about, that in the years to come, you're gonna have more petroleum engineers also learning about CO2 capture and utilization beyond just for sequestration and EOR. And that's one of the areas that we're also actively working on to make that whole process more efficient. When we talk about carbon neutral or carbon negative, we should consider the full carbon cycle, including the CO2 emitted by the product. What do you think? Yeah, I totally agree. And this is something that, a lot of the companies that are in this space, they have to, when you do the life cycle assessment, you have to define the boundaries, whether if it's gate to gate or from, the cradle to grave. For us, we do ask a lot of these questions from our clients. I think, it has to be disclosed definitely at the beginning, like what are the boundaries for the, the life cycle. But, for that, it's like one main benefit of focusing on chemicals as opposed to fuels is that, let's say, if you produce this bioethylene and then use it to produce PVC, and it becomes a pipe, goes under someone's house, and it's there for 100 years, that's a good method of sequestration. But if you're working on conversion of CO2 to biofuels and then it's burned again, you have to include that, of course, because a lot of that CO2 is back in the air to be considered. I know that some of the companies, the chemical companies, they try to get out of it. Like they don't want to take on the responsibility of the emissions that is out there because of their customers. But I agree, with the question that we do need to include the full cycle. Oh yeah, geological carbon storage. Okay. Yeah. So definitely, this is related to CO2 storage, sequestration, and EOR, and that's an active area. There is a lot of newer methods that are being explored, and for us also, this is an active research area that we're growing. Partly because when I look at CO2 EOR and CO2 sequestration, a lot of the methods really haven't changed much in the past, say 10 years, because we didn't have to change anything about it. And we still have a lot of the limitations. For example, CO2, you got to have the right geology for CO2 storage. Can we think of ways that we could pump CO2 into other type of geology, like old wells, for example, or for the EOR itself, can we mix some of the EOR principles with other methods, like what I was doing before this company at Biota Technology, with looking at DNA of microbes in the oil and rock for newer methods of, microbial enhance or recovery to allow us to use a lot more CO2 in the process, and maybe even produce some useful chemicals out. So I think for petroleum engineers who want to think about really the future for the oil and gas industry, that's a really nice area to be involved with. And a lot of these big companies are gonna have like more of a heavy focus in this area. What do you think about the impact of the current pandemic on CCUS and energy transition projects? So this is a really great question. I could see two scenarios. One is that, this whole situation, us sitting at home and, not being able to basically have life as usual, has served as a really tangible example of what the future could look like if we really don't do something about climate change and some of those kind of more drastic, consequences that we may have to face in the years to come. And hopefully this would be a reminder for a lot of decision makers to accelerate the initiatives around, fostering CCUS and help with those type of projects. And that's a lot of news that I'm hearing, that this is actually helping. At the same time, this also has put a big burden on, a lot of the companies that were funding those were the oil and gas companies, and now they're not doing good financially. And when that happens and they go into survival mode, they start canceling out those type of projects. So I don't have a crystal ball. I think only time will tell. But I'm really hoping that this will help accelerate those type of initiatives. So let me see, maybe we'll answer one more question and then go back to, closing comments by Hamid. Yeah, can you comment where you stand on IP and what is your strategy? This is a very competitive landscape. Yeah, I agree. I mean, this is we are at our core, we're an IP company, and that's our whole business model is based on generating IP. We own the IP for the basically microbes that we engineer. As you know, in nature, you cannot patent things that already exist in nature, such as microbes that you could isolate from oil or from different locations. However, once you start integrate different type of genes and change the genome of that microbe, then you could trademark it, you could own that microbe. And this is something that is a very established model. The best example is what is already in the agriculture industry, how we have companies like Monsanto who own the seeds for specific products that they have worked on optimizing for years and years, and they would license the seeds to the farmers, and then they control kind of how that's being distributed. For us, the same way, we build the microbes and then we license that to our clients, and then develop the processes around it for a scale up, and then they would package the whole thing and license it around the world. and then we get the royalties as well from the licensing revenues of the customer. So yeah, it's a very competitive area. It's a very fastly populated area. A lot of companies popping up every day. But you know, the one thing that I would say, there's a gap, and this is really for those of you who know me, I've tried to really be in this gray area, kind of uncomfortable overlap between different industries. And I think that's valuable because, you know, oil and gas people, it's hard for them to go out and really try to understand, you know, what can synthetic biology do for them. And then also for synthetic biology companies, it's hard to come into Houston oil and gas and try to start projects. You know, oil and gas industry is not the most receptive to new ideas, as you guys know. So what it takes is someone that is kind of an insider who could build the right partnerships and go out and bring those technologies and be able to translate and identify the right applications. And for me, I've been lucky in this case that I have my co-founder, Tara, who's also my sister, who comes from synthetic biology to help basically fill that gap. But that's also where a lot of IP is built. If you could imagine, you know, any of these synthetic biology companies, they wouldn't know anything about the subsurface. But we know that. And when you put the petroleum engineer next to a genetic engineer, a lot of amazing ideas happen. And that's really what we're capturing in our meetings. All right, so sorry, I'm gonna go to the next slide. And thank you so much, all of you, for listening to me. And you know how to reach me through LinkedIn, through Telegram, or any other way. And I look forward to any additional questions, comments that you might have. And back to you, Hamid.
Thank you very much, Mr. Karimi. It was a very inspiring presentation, and thank you very much for participating. Just for a short note for maybe people that actually missed the first part of the presentation, we actually will publish the recorded version of this presentation very soon in our social media that we have for the APPIH. And if you are interested to joining to our Telegram groups, you can just send a message to me at HSAMOUEI, or sending an email to me, samouei@gmail.com. Just for your information, our next presentation will be with Dr. Amir Mahmoud Khani on the 22nd of the April, and the week after presentation with Dr. Bharati from the Kansas University. Thank you very much, and have a safe rest of the day. Thank you.